Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Smile. All right, wonderful. This is a thrill for me. My name is Doron Kornbluth. All you really need to know about me is that I grew up in Montreal, Canada, and after university, I moved here to Israel. It is a distinct honor and privilege to be speaking with you this evening. For me, it is this morning. I'm calling you from Israel, but I know you're all over the state. Thank you to Chabad of Small Communities, all your wonderful Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins that are doing so much for your communities and for the Jewish world and the world at large. It's a real thrill. When I think of this topic, burial and cremation, a story comes to mind. The story is of this elderly gentleman who's laying in bed, not feeling so well, calls over his wife and says, "Honey, please come sit on the bed." She's kind of curious, hasn't done that before, sits down. "Honey, do you remember that when we were in our 20s and I broke my leg and you were there?" "Yes, honey, I was." "And do you remember when I was in my 40s and I had my heart attack? You were there." "Yes, honey, I was." "And do you remember in my 50s when I went bankrupt and you were there?" "Yes, honey, I was." So he says, "Honey, I have something important to tell you." She leans into him, tear comes from her eye, and he says, "Honey, you're bad luck." There are some subjects that seem like they're bad luck. People don't want to talk about them. People don't want to deal with them. Taboo. Burial, cremation, afterlife, it's one of those topics. We just don't want to deal with it. For that reason, I want to thank you for spending an hour together this evening. I want to thank all the Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins from small communities all over North America for organizing this. In other times, maybe you don't necessarily have to talk about this so much. It's interesting. There were some societies that we know of archaeologically that death was a big part of their culture, as far as we know from archaeology. The Egyptians had a book of the dead. The Tibetans had a book of the dead. In Judaism, we don't focus so much on death. By the way, the modern society, Western society, tends to avoid it completely. Taboo. But even in Judaism, we don't focus on it too much. When Jews have a drink, what do we say? L'chaim, to life. It's all about what we do in this world, why we're here. So even we don't want to focus too much on it. Some of you may remember that when Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, you know, those who were alive when JFK was assassinated, we remember exactly when it was and where we were. So those of us in Israel, we remember exactly where we were. It was November 1995. And he had become good friends with American President Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton came and gave a very nice eulogy at his funeral. The last two words were famous, became a bumper sticker, "Shalom Chaver," goodbye, my friend. But he said something in that eulogy that was quite remarkable. He said the Jewish prayer for death. Now, there really isn't a Jewish prayer for death. What do you think he was referring to? The Kaddish prayer. Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabbah. Bill Clinton said the Jewish prayer for the death doesn't even mention death, and it doesn't. May his name be elevated, be sanctified. We focus on life. So even we don't think, yes, of course we believe there's something after. It's one of the fundamental Jewish teachings. But we don't talk about it too much. Focus on what we're supposed to do here. I'm here to fix myself, to fix the world. So that probably was okay until recently. For all of Jewish history, Jews buried the dead. Roman historian Tacitus, when he was describing the Jews in his short little paragraphs to his compatriots, one of the things that stood out was that the Jews bury rather than burn the dead. Historically, this has been a given for almost 4,000 years. Jews always buried the dead. There were some things that were just standard. You know, it's sometimes interesting for me to think about how I got into this subject. I was never into this subject. it always sounded kind of morbid to me. I'm an educator. I fancy myself an educator, and I travel around before COVID-19 times. I travel around the world, speaking to Jewish communities around the world on very positive Jewish identity subjects. I wrote a book called Raising Kids to Love Being Jewish, and I speak to parents and grandparents about loving being Jewish. I wrote a book called Why Be Jewish. It's all about Jewish identity and pride, talk a lot about Israel. And I'm on a speaking tour in Florida, actually with a number of Chabad houses, Chabad shuls, about 10 years ago. And I noticed a advertisement in the Jewish newspaper from a Jewish funeral home offering Jewish cremations. And I was in shock. I didn't know there was such a thing. I'm a nice traditional Jewish boy from Montreal. Like Jewish cremations, there's just some things that like Jews, we all know, like Jews, we fast on Yom Kippur, we don't pay retail and we don't cremate. It's just like there's certain things that are just kind of standard, right? Well, that was true for most of history until about 20 years ago, when the ethos, the general decision of Western society moved. In 2017, the majority of Americans who died were cremated. It was the first time. It's now, if you look at all of the Americans, Jews, non-Jews, whoever, the majority are being cremated. It flipped from a minority to a minority in 2017. And the Jewish community is not that far behind. Estimates are something like 1 out of 3, 40%. So the question is why? What has changed in the last 20 years, 25 years? Forget about Jews for a minute. Now we have, thank God we have 300 people. It's beautiful to see. We can't open up the channels for verbal communication, but we can use the chat. So if you haven't used Zoom before, at the bottom there's a little chat. You just click on it, you chat to everyone. Tell me what you think, ladies and gentlemen. Why are cremation rates going up? Why have they gone up in the general community? Forget about Jews. Why are cremation rates going up? Why is it that it was a small number of people only a generation ago, and today it has become quite normal and acceptable? So assimilation, less expensive. You guys are doing great. Space, families don't live together anymore. Wow, this is amazing. You're getting all the good answers. Demand is up. Environmental concerns. You guys are typing so fast, I can't even read. This is amazing. Environment, people move around more. Okay, excellent. You're getting all the main ones, sustainability. So I want to go through these reasons. We're going to move quickly because the first part of our time together, I'm going to address these reasons. And then we're going to move over and talk about the reasons for burial. And that's the way I'm going to structure the talk, and then we'll have some time for questions and comments. Please feel free to use the chat to ask me a question now, even if you don't want to wait. I can't guarantee I'll see it. I'll try. There's a lot there. But and if not, I'll give you now my personal email that you can. I'm not good on the phone, but I am good on email. You can be in contact with me directly after the talk. My email is my name, Doron Kornbluth@gmail.com. I'm going to type that in, right now to the chat so that you have it. So again, if you have questions, you can ask them now in chat, or later we'll have a question and answer period. And if you don't have a chance, because we're so many people, feel free to email me, and I'll give you some other resources that you can use as well. There's a wonderful website you can go to. There's a book I'll recommend, mine, and a few other things. Okay, here we go. The first thing that was mentioned on your list was money. Let's talk about that at the end, okay? Let's get into the other ones. Environmental concerns. I'm not sure about you, but that's the time that I grew up, and I'm very environmentally conscious, and it's part of my life and part of the way I raise my children. And they're real concerns. In fact, there are two different directions, two different global ideas in terms of environmental concerns. One is the amount of land that it uses, the burial uses, and the other is what burial puts into the ground. Let's focus on the first one. The claim that cremation societies, by the way, that phrase always bugs me a little bit. They call themselves societies, which implies that they are nonprofit. It's $1 billion industry. They're anything but nonprofit. But the phrase that they use is that land is for the living. Anybody ever hear that phrase? I see a few people nodding. So land is for the living. The idea being, it's a moral point. The idea being that if you're a moral person, then you should realize that we have a limited amount of land. We have a growing population. And if you're a good person, you shouldn't waste the land on the dead. Interesting point, right? So theoretically, there's something there. There's only one problem. I did the math. You can do the math. I'm not the first to do the math. I did the math. I'm going to share one idea. I won't do a lot of stats with you today. It's boring. But I'll give you one statistic. Get this. If every American who died, and I'm not talking to every American right now, I'm talking to the Jewish community, which is less than 2% of the population. But if every American who died, the Western death rate is just under 1%, which means with a population of 340 million, the US has about 3 million deaths a year, just under 3 million deaths a year. I see there's some Canadians here. Welcome, fellow Canucks. Canada has about 35 million or something million people, so it's about 300,000 deaths, something like that, just under 1%. If all those people who died would choose burial, get this, it would take 10,000 years to use up 1% of America's landmass. Get that? I mean, that's an American step. In Canada, it's even more. 10,000 years to use up 1% of America's landmass. Of course, if you had a choice between land for the living and land for the dead, if there was no room, you choose land for the living. Of course. But there is no choice to be made. There's plenty of room. Google it. Or I have a simpler thing. Next time we're allowed to fly, when this COVID thing hopefully disappears, look down from the airplane, ladies and gentlemen. There's a ton of land. Again, if you want to be buried in downtown Manhattan, you have a problem. There's no land. But how often do you go to a cemetery anyway? Within 30 minutes or an hour of every urban area, there is plenty of land. Even here where I live in Israel. And on the way into Jerusalem, they're building these massive cemeteries. So there's plenty of land in the north of Israel, in the south of Israel. I'm a tour guide. I take people around. I mean, I'm not even talking about like Golan Heights. I mean, there's a tremendous amount. There's only 3 places in the world that I know of that do actually have land issues for burial: Hong Kong, Singapore, and parts of Japan. And we can talk about those. There are solutions. So the first idea that there's no land is just not true. We use far more land building new Walmarts every year than we do for the dead. So there really is plenty of land. There's no issue. The other environmental argument, and this dates back to one of the early environmental grassroots campaigns and changes, goes back to the 50s really, was the idea of look at what American burials are putting into the ground. An amazing amount of metal, Golden Gate Bridge after Golden Gate Bridge. You got to make the metal, you put it into the ground, metal caskets. They rust for thousands of years, damaging the environment. And then, of course, embalming. For those who don't know, I'll try not to be too graphic, but this is a class on burial and cremation, so there'll be a couple things that are a little uncomfortable. Embalming is when they remove the liquids, basically the blood, from a person, from a body, and replace it with preservatives. Formaldehyde was the classic preservative, not the only one. It's still used today, by the way, in many, many places. So environmentalists understandably object to all of these liters and gallons of toxic chemicals going into the ground. So there is no doubt that American burials are bad for the environment. But here's the question, ladies and gentlemen, rabbis and rebbitzins, you are not allowed to answer this question. Ladies and gentlemen, what commonality do these two things have? Metal caskets and embalming. Anything sound familiar? Any commonality between the two? What do you think, ladies and gentlemen? Well, I see the rabbis and rebbitzins are smiling. They're both not Jewish. Jewish burials do not allow either. We encourage simple wooden caskets Simple, plain wooden caskets, biodegradable, go straight back to the ground. Here in Israel, by the way, they don't even bury with a casket. They use one to carry the body, but when the body is actually put in the ground, it's buried in burial shrouds. Metal is seen as delaying the process. And we don't want to delay the process. In terms of embalming, it's considered desecration of the dead. Jewish burial has always been considered a model of environmentalism. Environmentalists are not in favor of cremation. Cremation uses a tremendous amount of fossil fuels. I don't know about you, but we're all trying to switch over our cars to hybrid or electric cars, cut down on fossil fuel use, and suddenly you're firing up coal usually, but even natural gas ovens and burning. There's many municipalities that do not allow crematorium beside schools because it releases chemicals, mercury and others into the air. So environmentalists are in favor of green burial. The two classic, most important by far factors in green burial: no embalming, no metal caskets. There's many other things that are important, and we do pretty well, and we should improve, and everybody should improve how the cemeteries are designed, et cetera, et cetera. So the first idea of environmentalism, it's simply not true. Cremation is not better for the environment, and environmentalists are not in favor of cremation. I remember seeing an ad from a cremation society, and it had a middle-aged woman walking with her elderly mother on the beach, sunset, you see the sun going down, dolphins are jumping in the air, like nature, but it's actually not true. Burial is the natural way. Okay, next subject that you raised was mobility issues. What I mean by that, there's different ways of phrasing it, is that in the old country, the grandparents, kids, grandkids, everybody would be in the same town. There would be a family plot. You live together and then they lie together for eternity. And people would visit the graves. Today, you've got the grandparents in one town. You've got the parents in a second town. You've got the grandkids, right, in a third town. So people understandably say, listen, no one's going to visit my grave anyway. So why have one? This is one of the questions that I got before, and it's something that I see a couple people have already written now. The idea being that if no one's ever going to visit the grave, why bother having one? Just put the remains into an urn and they can take me with them. So I have a trivia question for you. Rabbis and Rebbitzins, you are not allowed to answer. Ladies and gentlemen, get ready to answer on your chat. One of my side jobs before COVID-19 hit was that I'm a tour guide. I'm a licensed tour guide here in Israel. I take families and communities all over the country. Hopefully things will open up again. You can be in touch with me. I'm glad to. True or false, ladies and gentlemen? We can just do it with a thumbs up if you want, or chat. True is thumbs up. False is thumbs down. True or false, my favorite place to take tourists to visit here in Israel is the grave of Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu. True, I like taking people there. False, I don't take people there. I see a bunch of negatives. Wow, I see a bunch of negatives. Do I see any thumbs up? My gosh, I don't see any thumbs up. It can't be. Oh, good. Ruth, I see as a thumbs up. Hello. Anybody else? Anybody else? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Wow. Okay, very good. So the answer is, I'm sorry, Ruth, but it was a thumbs down. It's not true. I never take people to the grave of Moses. And there's two ways that we know. Number one, he never made it into Israel. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, he wants to come to Israel. We can hop on a plane. Normal times, we can hop on a plane and get here and come for a visit or whatever. It was his fondest wish, his biggest dream. He never made it in. He's buried in what is now the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. The second reason is the Bible makes it clear we don't know exactly where he's buried. I see Neil wrote that. Thank you. Exactly right. We don't know exactly where he's buried. God hid the place of his burial because Moses was so great that people would start to regard it as some kind of idol worship. So now here's my question, ladies and gents. Has anybody ever visited the grave of Moses? No one has ever visited his grave in 3,300 years. And yet, although we know archaeologically that at that time, thousands of years ago, there were many methods of disposal of the dead. Throughout history, there have been tons of approaches. The Tibetans put a body on a tower, let the vultures eat it. The Vikings put it on a raft, set it afire. Cremation in archaeology was standard throughout most of history. Yet God did not choose any of those. He chose burial because we get two things in our minds mixed up. We think of visiting a grave and having a grave as being the same thing. And if no one's going to visit it, why bother having it? In fact, I don't know if anybody here on the class is in Florida right now, but Florida has a relatively high cremation rate. And one of the explanations is it has a lot of retirees. So where am I going to be buried? Here in Florida? I've only been here for 20 years or 10 years. My kids don't live here. My grandkids don't live here, right? The people I know are all going to die pretty soon. They're seniors. I'm going to go back to New York, right? I haven't lived there for 20 years. My kids aren't even there. Where am I going to be buried? So why bother having a grave? In our minds, we connect it, but there's actually no connection. If you get a connection, if it's important to you to visit graves, I connect to visiting graves. Don't worry, I don't go every day, not a weirdo. But every time I go back to Montreal to visit my parents, I always go. Try to, except in the middle of the winter when it's like completely inaccessible. But otherwise, I always try and go to the cemetery, my mother's side, my father's side, and it means something to me. But you don't have to go. There's no obligation in Judaism. And having a grave is completely separate from visiting it. A person deserves a grave, whether it's going to be visited or not. Moses is the perfect example. We'll talk about why. And the mobility issues, think of it this way. So Judy was closest to her parents. So she's going to take the remains, right? They call them the cremated remains, the cremains, whatever, the ashes. So, she's going to get older, move out of the house, move into a smaller place. She had 2 urns. She's going to pass the urns on to her kids. And how many urns are they going to have? 4. And the next generation is going to have 8. And the next generation, you get my point? Like, our lives and our homes are simply not meant for the long-term respectful keeping of cremated remains. Eventually they're disposed of, nicely or not. So the point is, yes, it is harder in the modern world. And yes, you may not be able to visit, but first of all, we all know there may be some kid or some grandkid that connects a little bit more to their history, to their family, genealogy, Judaism, and they want a grave to visit. And the body deserves the place, whether it's going to be visited or not. Some of the other reasons that you mentioned, just looking quickly at your list, some people are not comfortable with decomposition. To be eaten by worms and bugs, it's gross. So I want to tell you about the biggest surprise I had when I got into the research for my book on this subject. Remember, I told you the story that I was actually in Florida and I was on a speaking tour, and I was speaking about, not speaking about this. I didn't know anything about burial and cremation about 10 years ago. And I was talking about my normal topics, and I see the newspaper report, the newspaper ad, and I start getting into it. And I spent 3 years intensively researching this subject. The result of that is my book on the subject, Cremation or Burial. Right? So, the biggest surprise that I found in researching the book, the biggest surprise was that I always thought, and many of you may think this, I don't know, I always thought that cremation was something like a microwave oven. Anybody have this thought? Forgive me for being disgusting. You have to have the basic facts. I thought you put the body in, you press a button, 5 minutes later, it's over and done with. You got ashes, put them into the urn, and it's done. Sorry, guys. And I'm sorry for what I have to share with you right now, but it's something that you have to know. A typical cremation is not 5 minutes long. A typical cremation is 90 minutes to 2 hours. If you're a bigger person like me, in the last 6 months of COVID, I put on over 15 pounds. I don't know about you. It's not good. So if you're a bigger person, it can last up to 3 hours. For people who are considered obese, it can be up to 4 hours. During those hours of cremation, the body is not still and calm and quiet. The muscles are expanding and contracting. The brain is sizzling. It is a disgusting, awful, smelly process. Now, I'm not going to sit here and claim to you that burial is pleasant. Decomposition is not nice to contemplate. What I am going to point out is that they're both kind of gross. And one is the natural way of every living thing. A plant grows, blossoms, and goes back to the earth. An animal is born, runs around the forest, lays down, goes back to the earth. Burial is the natural way of every living thing. Cremation is a man-made, artificial grasp at control. So they're both kind of gross, but one is natural and one is artificial. So as you go through all the reasons, and if there's any others we can talk later, I think we've covered the main ones. As you go through all the reasons that people choose cremation, they're not true, except one. All the reasons that people list for choosing cremation today, use of land, environmentalism, mobility, discomfort with all these reasons. When you actually research them, when you actually look into them, they actually fall away. They are all not true. They are all based on misinformation except one. I'm a straight, honest person, and there is one reason for cremation that actually makes sense and is undeniable. What am I thinking of, ladies and gents? What do you think? People are typing it, money. At the end of the day, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, cremation is significantly cheaper than burial. I want to be very clear. Money should never be an issue. And in Jewish communities, and I'm involved in this subject, and your Chabad rabbis and rabbitans are involved, it's never. For someone who has legitimate financial issues, the Jewish community never says no. Something's in Florida and in New York, there are very, very reasonably they're free Hebrew burial. There's a cemetery in Florida, in Florida that takes people who do not want to spend a fortune on burial. You can contact your Chabad Rabbi or Rebbitzin. They'll give you information about it. There's always ways of dealing with it. But the truth is that for many people, cost is an issue. The difference can be thousands of dollars. Now, there are some cremations that are expensive, and there are some burials that are cheap, but overall, the norm is that most burials cost more than most cremations. So we have to flip it. Until now, what we've done is to say that, that the reasons why people are choosing cremation today don't really make sense. It's not good for the environment. Burial is actually better. It doesn't solve mobility issues, even if kids are not going to visit. I saw somebody just chatted as we discussed in terms of visitation and Moses, discomfort, all those reasons. But at the end of the day, it does cost a little more in most cases, sometimes a lot more. So the question is, why is it worth the extra money? So, gentlemen, when you propose to your wife, I assume you did not take the ring from the bottom of a Cracker Jack box, right? I would hope not, right? Some things we spend a little more on. I want to claim that this is one of them, and I want to explain why. Okay. In the Kovna ghetto in World War II, there was a rabbi. The rabbi's name was Rav Ephraim Oshry, and he was a well-known, respected rabbi before the war. And he survived actually, and he told the following story. He said that one day in the ghetto, a Nazi officer, blonde hair, blue eyes, bursts into his room. Rabbi Oshry thinks that he's about to meet his maker, And this Aryan-looking German officer slams the door behind him and starts speaking to the rabbi in perfect Yiddish. Rabbi, I'm a Jew. The way I've survived the war so far is by this. I look the part and I have fake papers. I'm not doing anything bad, God forbid. I'm pushing papers in the back. But I'm a very sick man, Rabbi. I only have a few weeks to live. And I know what's going to happen to me. What's going to happen to me is they're going to bury me with a Nazi cross over my body in a Nazi cemetery surrounded by Nazis. Rabbi, I've done this to survive so far, but I can't do that for eternity. Can I be cremated to avoid the fate of being buried with a Nazi cross in a Nazi cemetery? And Rabbi Oshri responded to him, my dear, dear child, no, you can't. And he cited source after source. The first one, by the way, is in about 2 weeks from now in our regular Torah reading, Deuteronomy 21:22, I believe, where it talks about an evil, a person who was put to death in Judaism, which is very rare, right? The Talmud says that someone was put to death in Judaism once in 70 years, and the court is too bloodthirsty, meaning that the death penalty is a deterrent. It's not a real thing in Judaism. It doesn't happen very often at all. And even in that case, the Torah says that you should take the body down and bury it. Surely bury it. It's in the Talmud. It's in Maimonides. It's in the Code of Jewish Law. It is all over Judaism. It's all over the Bible itself. Abraham buried Sarah. Abraham was buried. Rachel was buried. Jacob was buried. Oh, if I was making a religion, I don't know if I'd make it such a big deal. But Judaism does. So the first reason that we say it's worth the extra money is that it's part of our religion. A surprisingly strong part, actually. Number two, and I'm moving quickly because I want to have some time for questions and comments at the end. Number two, it's interesting that if you were to make a map of the world, and two maps of the world, actually, one map of the world would be a map of a monotheistic belief, where people believe in one God versus where people believe in no gods or many gods. And you were to make another map of burial and cremation rates, where people bury, where people cremate, more or less. Incredibly, those two maps have a very close superimposing overlap. Meaning, where people believe in God, burial rates are much higher. And where people believe in no God, or people believe in many gods, cremation rates are much higher. Simple examples: India, the Far East, belief in many gods, cremation is the norm. When Europe was considered a Christian community, right, burial was the norm. The Catholic Church outlawed cremation for 1,500 years since Charlemagne. It's only the last 20, 30 years that's really taken off. Post-Christian Europe, cremation rates have gone up. Even within North America, given the American example, if you look at the map of the states, the Bible Belt, so to speak, has far higher burial rates, and the more quote-unquote secular Northeast, the coasts and California have far higher cremation rates. There's some kind of connection between belief in God and burial. And people around the world make this connection intuitively. I actually think that part of it is not just, it's at the proof text of monotheism, the proof text of Judaism, the Torah, the Bible, says very clearly that every human being is created in the image of God, bestselling Elohim, Jewish or not Jewish. Now, that's not a physical thing. God doesn't have a physical image, but there's something holy about our image. And you don't mess with that. You don't mess with the divine image. I don't stick it in an oven. I bury it gently. Ladies and gents, think of it this way. We bury treasure. We burn garbage. Ever think about that? When you were 8 and your pet dog died, I can virtually guarantee that your mother didn't say, okay, honey, let's fire up the barbecue. No, she said, let's dig a hole in the back and bury Spot. We bury things that we love. We bury treasure. We burn garbage. And people sense that. The human being, the human body, there's something divine about us. There's something spiritual. There's something special about being a human being in the image of God. And people around the world recognize that. Another idea. Everybody knows that, I think everybody knows that it's, modern world, and maybe not everybody knows, but there's a custom in Judaism where when someone dies, God forbid, someone dies, we tear Kriya. Have you heard that phrase before? You know what that is? Tear Kriya? It's actually a double phrase. The word Kriya in Hebrew means tear. So like we tear, that's what it is. Tearing Kriya, God forbid it should happen to us, means you take your outer garment, the mourners, the 7 mourners, right? Mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, spouse, and tear the garment while we're sitting Shiva. Now, in the modern times, by the way, I don't know in your community, but I've noticed something recently in the last 15, 20 years that sometimes people put a ribbon on and tear the ribbon. Have you noticed this? It's like a new custom. It's a very sweet idea. By the way, that's not the point, though. It's not supposed to be a ribbon that you can take off and throw out. The whole point is that it's supposed to be my clothing. It's not normal. I can't go on. I'm torn. It's not supposed to be external to it's supposed to be who I am. It's supposed to be, okay. So anyways, I want you to think of the following image. When a person dies, the earth itself tears Kriya. A hole is dug in the ground. There is a gaping wound in the planet. It looks wrong. It's painful to see. But then the body is lovingly, calmly put back in the earth. Community members, family, friends, the rabbi, gently pour the earth back on. There is healing. Life does go on. But there's a gravestone. There's a scar. The person is never forgotten. The earth itself tears Kriya. It's a beautiful image. To be honest, I'm not sure where I came to it, how I came to it. It's a beautiful image that's been in my mind for years now. And it teaches a lesson. The lesson is that healthy societies need the presence of the dead. I noticed there were some chats about this at the beginning, that our modern world is in denial of death. Doesn't want to think about it, talk about it. They call it the toilet assumption. Just flush it, get rid of it. And we say the opposite. We need the presence of the dead. People today often look at life as a snapshot. Hey, what's happening now? What's happening now? Life is not a snapshot. Life is a movie. And we're born in the middle and we die in the middle. And we build on what we receive from the past and we give to the future. And we're part of a historic community. And cemeteries teach that to us. We're part of something forever. A couple of other ideas, and then we'll have time for questions and comments. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, God forbid this would happen in your local Chabad or any other synagogue, any other shul. God forbid. But let's say there's a fire in the synagogue, a fire in the shul, and you can save the Torah scrolls. Do you risk your life to save the Torah scroll? Yes, you risk your life to save the Torah scroll, or no, you don't risk your life to save the Torah scroll. I'm looking around. I see Dr. Gabriel, you're saying yes. I see Amy is saying no. I see a lot of no's. I see a few yeses. Mo, you're saying no. Very good. So ladies and gentlemen, the answer is, as wonderful as your sentiment was, Dr. Gabriel, you don't risk your life to save a Torah scroll. If the fireman tells you, yeah, you can go in, no problem. The fire's over there, it's controlled, no risk, then of course, A Torah scroll is the holiest object that we have. Of course you should save it. But if there is any risk to your life, you're not allowed to risk it to save a Torah scroll. Because a human being, by the way, man, woman, young, old, more observant, knowledgeable, less observant, not observant at all, Jewish, not Jewish, doesn't matter. A human being is holier than a Torah scroll. Now, ladies and gents, if a Torah scroll is beyond repair, there's mistakes happen to Torah scrolls every once in a while. You find a mistake. So most mistakes, the scribe can fix it. What if it's unfixable? We bury it. I see someone just said. Exactly right. We bury a Torah scroll. Everybody's heard this. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're holier than Torah scrolls, all of us, and we bury the dead. It's an amazing idea when you think about it. Two other quick things, and then we'll move to answering some of your questions. Like this. I'll tell you a personal story for a sec. I speak a lot, you can tell. I'm not good in terms of musical stuff, and I hate leading the prayers in synagogue. I'm in synagogue every day. I mean, now we're praying in my parking lot upstairs. That we have a building and all the neighbors get together. But I go every day. But I'm just not good. I don't have that musical quality, so I don't do it. With the exception of my grandmother's yard site. I'm very close to my grandmother, and on the day of her death, her yard site, there's a tradition to lead the prayers. So I kind of like have a mixed feelings every year when it comes up. Looking forward to doing it for her memory, thinking of her, feeling connected to her, and dreading doing it because I don't like being public singing, whatever, Okay. So one year I'm on a speaking tour somewhere, I forget, and I show up in the shul in the morning, and the rabbi's not there, and the chazan, the cantor is not there, and a bunch of older gentlemen, look at me, and they're very happy when I walk in because I'm a religious-looking guy, and okay, I'll lead the prayers. I'm like, great guys, it's not my thing really. There's nobody else there that knows how, so I lead the prayers. So okay, at least fine. It's a week or two until my grandmother's yard site. At least I'll prepare for that. Fine. I'll go back to my hotel room after I lead the prayers, and just look in the calendar to say, okay, so when is I just led the prayers on my grandmother's yard site? True story from me to you. I had no idea that was the day. I thought it was a different day, but mixed up in the calendar. Things happen that are not so easy to understand. There's something going on. Deep down, many of us sense that I have a soul, there is a God, there's something special going on. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that soul that we have connected to God, the special weird things that happen sometimes in life, that soul does not just leave its body immediately upon death. Imagine a woman is married to a wonderful guy for 50 years, and God forbid, he dies, and she gets up from Shiva, puts on her party dress, and goes to the bar cruising gentlemen. Does it sound normal to you? Of course not. When you're close to something or somebody for years, for decades, when this is your partner, you don't just move on. The body and the soul in Judaism are not enemies. Some religions see it that way, by the way, and they deny the body all physical pleasure, right? We don't. God is a good God that gave us a good physical world. We just have to use it correctly, uplift it. So the body and the soul are not enemies, they're partners. And when the body dies, the soul doesn't just leave. The soul is connected to its body. According to Jewish tradition, during the period of Shiva, it goes back and forth between the place of burial, that's where it is, body connection is, and the Shiva house to hear what is being said about it. Slowly but surely, it goes back up to heaven, although always remains connected to that place of burial. So, to be very clear, it's the modern world. Things happen. Chances are, statistically, looking at over 300 people on this call, which is wonderful, chances are that many of you have loved ones who are cremated. They may have asked to do it, you may have done it. This is not a class about guilt. I'm not into guilt. What happened in the past happens. People make decisions based on what they knew, and that's okay. Give a donation in their memory. right? To your local Chabad. They didn't ask me to say that, but it's true. Chabad is doing wonderful things around the world. Don't get stuck in the past. Move forward. But the single greatest thing that the soul wants after death is to be buried. It's the closure of life. Let's summarize, and then we'll move to questions and comments. We started out with the realization that people like denying this subject. We don't like talking about it. It's uncomfortable, of course, but we have to talk about it today. And that's why I applaud all you wonderful Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins for organizing this. Rabbi Hecht, I don't know where you are, for organizing this, and for all of you for joining. So this is an important question. It's perhaps the last decision that you'll make on planet Earth, so to speak. So let's get the proper information to make that decision. We went through all the reasons that people choose cremation today, and all of them fall apart. They are all based on misinformation. People think it's better for the environment. It's not. People think there's not enough land. There is. People think mobility issues. No. People, decomposition, blah, 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 blah. There's only one reason that actually makes some sense. And that is that in most cases, cremation is cheaper, sometimes far cheaper. So what does one do with that? Well, if you're into pre-planning, which I suggest, talk to your rabbi, organize everything early so it doesn't have to be a headache for the kids, for the grandkids, when the grief hits, God forbid. But, it's a coffee a day or coffee a week. I mean, it's not that much, and just how much we spend on XYZ, just plan it early and it's done. But even if it does cost us a few extra $1,000, whatever it's going to be, my claim is that it's worth it. Again, if you can't afford it, be in touch with your rabbi, talk to NASC, the National Association of Chevra Kadishas, and things can be done to help. But even if it is extra money, why? Well, I only touched some of the ideas because we have a short amount of time. It's part of our religion. Healthy societies need burial. The body and the soul are connected. They are partners. You don't just leave the body. You don't just burn the body. You calmly put it in its proper place. We talked about monotheists, people who believe in God intrinsically, intuitively connect to burial. We talked about being like God. God chose burial 3,300 years ago, even for Moses, even when there was many other choices and even when no one would visit the grave. And one final idea, and then we'll get to some questions and comments. I don't know where I got this image from, but I have this monologue in my mind. It's of an elderly Jewish gentleman. And he says to his kids, listen, kids, I may not have been the best Jew on planet Earth. I didn't really know that much, and I didn't really do that much. And maybe if I knew more, I would live life differently. Maybe not. But there's one thing that I want to share with you. And ladies and gentlemen, if there's one message tonight that I, Doron, can share with you, it's this. I may not have been the most perfect Jew in the world, but I was born a Jew, and I am proud to be a Jew, and I want to die and be buried as Jews have died and been buried for thousands of years. I want the Kaddish to be said. I want the rabbi to arrange for a proper tahara, the ceremony where they wash the body. I want the Hebrew prayers said. I want to be buried according to Jewish law in a Jewish cemetery. I want it to be done right. Because at the end of the day, in my final statement to the world, I want to declare, here lies a proud Jew. So I don't know about you. To me, wow, that hits home. It's not an easy subject, ladies and gentlemen. It's a personal one. It's a hard one. And the modern world, many people we know are choosing otherwise. So that's what I wanted to share with you. I'm going to list to you a few resources. First of all, the best Jewish resource you have is your local Chabad Rabbi in Rebbitzin. Talk to them, go to them. They're the source for Judaism all over the world. For those who want some more information online, there is a website called peacefulreturn.org, PEACEFUL return.org. It's in English and Russian, a couple of things. It has some of my material. I made a 4-minute movie that's there that you might enjoy. It's got a lot of other things. If you have some questions, you can email me. I gave you my email before. For those who are interested, in the stories and the stats. That's my book on the subject, Cremation or Burial. That's me, Doron Kornbluth. It's by a company called Mosaica Press. So you can get that on mosaicapress.com, Mosaica press.com, for you to learn about and share with the ones you love. Okay, we have about 10, 15 minutes. Questions, comments. Rabbi Hecht, how am I going to do this? Just look at the chat. Thank you. Okay, we only have a few minutes left, ladies and gents, because I do have to leave in a few minutes. But again, my email, if I do not answer your question, and I'm glad to try and answer your email. My email is my personal email, is my name, doronkornbluth@gmail.com, DORONKORNBLUTH@gmail.com. You will find many answers, by the way. Your Chabad Rabbi and Rebbitzin will obviously know a lot about the subject. You can go to that website, peacefulreturn.org. There's a lot of information. My book at mosaicapress.com has a lot of information. But I'll try and just answer a few. As Rabbi Hecht, as you were speaking, I was just going through some of the chats. And so some people said, one of the reasons that people choose cremation today is because of secularization, which is actually tautological, and it's actually true. The less traditional people do less traditional things. Or there's Buddhist influences and other things like that today. All of that is definitely true as to why people are choosing cremation today. I just always think of my ties. I'm not wearing a tie right now. We're all informal. We're all friends. But my kids are always complaining. On Shabbat, I try and wear a tie. And my kids are always complaining, your tie's too wide, your tie's too thin. And I always get mixed up. And I'm like, they want me to get rid of my old ties. And my point is like, listen, I'm not getting rid of my old wide ties, because and I know that in 5 years, they're coming back, right? Fads come, fads go, fads come, gads go. That's just the way it is. So I don't think that it's necessarily the best thing to choose burial or cremation based on fads today. We choose it on important decisions to be made based on information and your research and your thinking and your soul. So another things that people asked, two more things I'll try and get to very, very quickly, is that I didn't mention the single most classic explanation that Jewish sources give for burial and against cremation. Any of you know what I'm talking about? Anybody surprised by something that I did not mention? There's this guy who wrote this book, Cremation or Burial, right? Giving a talk on cremation or burial, and he didn't mention the classic Jewish explanation. The rabbis are all smiling. The rabbis are all smiling because they're wondering the same thing too. So resurrection of the dead. If you would ask a rabbi throughout history, look at the Jewish sources, why is burial so important? The first answer would not be environment and this and that and identity. It would be resurrection of the dead. Now, I want to be honest with you, now that we're all friends, all 330 or whatever it is of us, I want to be honest with you. When I think of the dead coming back to life, you know what I think of? Thriller. Remember Michael Jackson, the first great music video of the 1970s? It was like 7 minutes long. It was incredible. The zombies coming out of the ground. Listen, I'm a child of the 70s. What can I do? So that's what I'm embarrassed. That's what I think about. So when I think of the idea of the dead coming back to life, unfortunately, my intuitive thing is like a weird zombie movie. There's a lot of beautiful ideas that their core is beautiful, holy, Jewish. But because we see them through the prism of Hollywood, they seem really weird, right? The idea of Mashiach, that Chabad has done so much to bring back into Jewish life, the idea of Mashiach is a true, beautiful idea of somebody coming and leading us. It gets sort of warped and people don't understand it, and it seems weird. So resurrection of the dead is not about zombies coming back. It's the idea that DNA, unless it's burned, DNA lasts forever. The Talmud refers to something called the lose bone, the bone that is indestructible. I personally think of it as the DNA. We can clone things now. What does that show? It shows that physicality is permanent. It has a place in the future. I don't know how it's going to work. I don't think anybody really does. But the idea that our bodies are holy and they have a role to play in the future, that's a core part of Judaism. One other idea that people asked about in the chats that I think is pretty common. People ask, can I scatter the ashes or bury the ashes in a Jewish cemetery? It's interesting, in the 1890s in England, there was a movement towards cremation. It was one of those fads, comes and goes. And the rabbis declared, no, you're not allowed to, which is interesting because once a person's body is burned, they're talking 1600 degrees over here. There's nothing left. The DNA doesn't exist. You can't tell one apart from another from a cat. I mean, so why not? I can put dirt into a Jewish cemetery. Why can't I put cremated remains into a Jewish cemetery? And the rabbis made a very interesting decision in England over 100 years ago. They said, if we allow you to bury remains in a Jewish cemetery, you're going to start thinking that cremation is okay. And we want to make it very clear that there is a Jewish way in death and burial, and it's burial, and it's not cremation. So if you have cremated remains, scatter them in a park, but just for your own mental and psychological state. The main thing. So Dr. Gabriel, vous avez demandé, so he's asking in French, is it true that reincarnation, what is the thing? Yeah, that the soul doesn't die. The soul does not die. Most certainly, it is permanent. We brought that idea to the world. And let's leave with that final image. The one that means the most to me, I hope maybe some of you connect to it, where the gentleman is saying to his children, I may not have been the best Jew in the world, but I was born a Jew, and I'm proud to be a Jew. And I want to die and be buried as Jews have died and been buried for thousands of years. Thank you very much for spending this time together, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Rabbi Hecht, and all of the Chabads for putting this together. Again, if I didn't have time to answer your question, please email me, doronkornbluth@gmail.com, or you can find more information from your Chabad Rabbi in my book, Cremation and Burial, at mosaicapress.com. Thank you very much. All the best, everybody. Be well.